Today on the In All Kinds of Weather forecast, the Gator baseball team is in the NCAA Baseball Tournament. Did they deserve a bid? What do we think of the draw? And how will the Gators fare in the Stillwater Regional? We'll talk about all that and more today on the In All Kinds of Weather forecast. Welcome back to the In All Kinds of Weather forecast. I am your host, Neil Schulman. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at All Kinds Weather, Facebook under the name In All Kinds of Weather. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or anywhere else you get your podcasts or shows, this is the In All Kinds of Weather forecast. Please give us a 5-star rating and a nice review. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube if you're watching there and comment your thoughts below on what we're talking about today. And today we're talking about the fact that the Gator baseball team, for all its trials and tribulations, is in the NCAA Baseball Tournament. Long wait. We had to bite our nails a little bit, but after that long wait, the Gators, we found out, did get into the field of 64. Actually, not even a bubble team. The last 4 teams in the field were Coastal Carolina in Gary Gillmore's final season there. Nice story. Indiana, James Madison, and Central Florida. So Gators actually cleared that bubble by a good margin. Florida did appear to be safely into the field of 64, or as safe as they could be with a 28-27 record. And they will go to Oklahoma State's Stillwater Regional. Also there are the Nebraska Cornhuskers and the Niagara Purple Eagles. So the obvious first question is, did Florida deserve a bid? And the answer to that really depends on how you define the word deserve. Is Florida one of the 64 best teams in the country? Did they prove to be one of the 64 best teams in the country? Is their resume one of the 64 best in the country? And if we're going off of any of those definitions, then the answer has to be yes, because the number one strength of schedule that Florida has, besides their name, suggests that their 28-27 record would look a whole lot different if they played in the Big Ten or the Big Sky or the Mountain West or Conference USA, but they don't. They don't play in any of those leagues. They play in the SEC, which, by the way, got 11 teams into the tournament field, and I would argue would have had 12 if Ole Miss had a winning record. You have to have a winning record to get in the tournament. Obviously, Ole Miss's RPI and schedule strength were there, but they had a losing record, so it wasn't even a conversation. But flip 1 or 2 games for them, and you get 12 SEC teams into the field. So that is how strong the Southeastern Conference is, to those of you who do not follow Southeastern Conference baseball that closely, but are just following along this show to see the Gators road forward because you're Gator fans. Now, if we're talking strictly about Florida's record, well, obviously, 28-27 is not a very good record. Certainly a worse record than that of Northeastern, who wasn't even close, apparently not even one of the first 4 left out, with a 38-17 record, or a TCU, who got left out at 33-21, or a Charleston, my local team now, who got left out at 41-14. And spoiler, they are not happy here. I was out this morning getting some stuff at Publix, and I mean, they were preparing for a party. I mean, you can see a lot of people. It's not like it's a Florida or an LSU or Mississippi State type of baseball program, but I live fairly close to the college, so there are college kids out and about thinking, yeah, we're going to be in the tournament. We're gearing up for a party. I imagine they're not very happy right now. But anyway, I would say that because, yes, Florida has such a bad record compared to those teams. The reason for that, of course, Florida played the number 1 toughest schedule in the country. The context of that schedule strength has to matter. That additional data point has to matter. Other factors also matter, like, I don't know, the fact that TCU had the 38th toughest schedule compared to Florida's number 1 ranked strength of schedule, or the fact that Charleston had the 117th ranked strength of schedule. Yeah, I'd say that those things do matter. I'd say they matter quite a great deal, because if you put Florida in the Colonial, or not the Colonial, they changed it. It's now the Coastal Athletic Association. You put Florida in Charleston's conference, you give Florida Charleston's schedule, I would say Florida probably, for all its faults, probably has a much better record than 28 and 27. And that's not to say that I don't feel bad for Charleston or TCU, because I do. But to argue that the team that had the toughest schedule in the country with series wins over two top 8 seeds in Texas A&M and Georgia, plus series wins over regional 2 seeds in Mississippi State and LSU, that's just not a good argument. Now, if you want to argue James Madison, you want to argue a Georgia Tech, yeah, those teams getting in over TCU and Charleston, that's a better argument. But Florida is just, it's not going to be a winning argument because the Gators having an RPI in the top 30, plus that strength of schedule being number 1, it's not going to cut any ice. And look, people are saying right away, Scott Strickland, the Florida AD, had involvement because he's on the committee. You could say it's SEC bias, whatever. I mean, I've made no bones about how this Florida team plays all year long. If you're a fan of another team watching the show, maybe go back and watch our previous shows, like last fall, for example. I said all last November long, Florida football did not deserve to play in a bowl game based on their APR, which is how the NCAA decides bowl bids for 5 and 7 teams. I said, no, sorry, you don't win 6 games. This team simply has no business playing in a bowl game. They don't deserve it. I'm on record saying that. Not a homer. The mantra of this pod is keep it respectful, but keep it real. And I'll tell you when I don't think Florida deserves something. I've got a history of doing that, and I will continue to do that. This Florida team has a lot of flaws, but they did belong in the NCAA tournament because of that strength of schedule, which is why the record is so mediocre, and the fact that it cleared the bar of having a winning record. That said, we all know that this Florida team has a lot of flaws because, you know what? We've watched Gator baseball this year. They're pretty glaringly apparent. And if you haven't, if you're one of those who only follows Gator baseball in the postseason, the very basic synopsis of the season is that the pitching situation let us down early, as our bats were banging out a lot of hits, but not quite enough to compensate for the pitching issues. Throughout the course of the year, the pitching took a step forward. It, I would say, went from atrocious to just plain bad to probably slightly below average for a D1 power conference NCAA tournament baseball team. But then the defense started letting us down. Costly mistakes started happening that were pretty avoidable. We ran ourselves into double plays. We wouldn't communicate in the outfield sometimes. We let a fly ball go over our left fielder's head. And, you know, I love Tyler Shelnup, but that's just a play that SEC outfielders got to make that. So just enough things like that happening from a lot of different players. Don't want to put it on one guy, but there was just a collection of things that just kept happening that resulted in Florida beating themselves and, you know, not getting the clutch hits, running ourselves into stupid outs. You know, do that enough times, and eventually it painted the picture of a team that what could go wrong did go wrong, to the point at which missing the NCAA tournament doorstep was approached and then reached until Florida found a way to beat Georgia in the final 2 games of the regular season. When it was out of chances, when it was out of security nets, they had to win those last 2 games. They did that to just barely get themselves over that 500 record. And that is just a very basic way of memorializing the regular season. But just the same way that the regular season is over for Florida, it is also over for teams like Tennessee and Kentucky and Texas A&M. That's all the past, and it doesn't matter now because all you have to do now is win your regional, win your super regional, win your pool in the College World Series, and then win the finals in a best 2 out of 3 series. Florida now has that chance just the same way that all those top seeds do. So Florida, obviously, because of their issues, has a more difficult path to doing so. It's going to start in Stillwater, Oklahoma, with the Nebraska Cornhuskers in that Oklahoma State regional. Also, Niagara will be there. That leads us to the question of what do we think of the draw? And the answer to this question has to be relative because as a regional 3, you know, beggars can't be choosers. It's not an ideal draw because I don't know such a thing even exists for a regional 3 seed, but it's certainly not a terrible one. And let's start with the playing field because Oklahoma State's O'Brate Stadium is not that deep, especially in right field. Right field line is just 325 away from home plate. For Jack Caglione, that is a dream. Also, it is not a symmetrical field the way that Condren is in Gainesville. In fact, the left field foul pole is actually farther away than it is in Condren. It's 332 versus 330, but the wind can play tricks in this park in northern Oklahoma. Go watch that regional in 2022 against Arkansas. Get a better feel of that. Those games are on YouTube, and you'll see for yourself. So that's the park. It plays small. It's hitter friendly. A lot of runs can be scored here by the teams that play here. And speaking of the teams that play here, let's start with Nebraska, Florida's first opponent. Nebraska as a team is hitting 289 on the year with 66 homers. That's not really great for a Big Ten team. Certainly not terrible, but nothing that just jumps off the page and horrifies you. Other than Josh Caron, who's hitting 320 on the year with 16 homers, there's really just not a lot there in that lineup that can punish you. Case Anderson and Rhett Stokes are the only two other guys hitting above 310 for the year. Again, Nebraska is in the Big Ten, not what it is in football for baseball. So factor that into what you think of those numbers. They are solid pitching wise. They're probably going to start their ace, Brett Sears, against Florida, and his 2.02 ERA does look scary, but then you look at the teams he faced to get that ERA, and the fear kind of dies. And let's just rattle them off. Baylor did not make the NCAA tournament. Grand Canyon got in as a regional 4 seed, as a small conference automatic qualifier. Charleston, many say that they got snubbed, but they didn't make the tournament. South Alabama didn't make the tournament. Nichols, another team that only got in because they won their conference tournament. New Mexico State didn't make the tournament. Northwestern didn't make the tournament. Ohio State didn't make the tournament. Rutgers didn't make the tournament. Maryland, getting a theme here. Maryland didn't make the tournament. Iowa didn't make the tournament. Minnesota didn't make the tournament. Indiana slipped in as one of the last 4 teams into the tournament. Michigan State didn't make the tournament. Penn State didn't make it, and Purdue didn't make it. So now, with all that in hand, that 2.02 ERA looks a little bit less scary, right? Because now you realize, oh, well, there's no LSU or Texas A&M or Kentucky or Tennessee or FSU or Georgia that are jumping off the page at you as the opponents that he had to face to get that 2.02 ERA. So context, again, context, that does matter. Nebraska, I would say as a whole, not a bad 2 seed, but for the Gators, I would much rather face them in the 2-3 game than say Duke or a Wake or Indiana State or a Dallas Baptist. Those teams hit home runs in bunches. This team in Nebraska has one guy in Josh Caron that can do that. Not really a whole lot else behind him with home run power. So Florida, I would think, would get a favorable or you can think that Florida has a favorable matchup against Nebraska. Now for Niagara, the 4 seed. They do hit for average, not for a lot of power. And they're in the Metro Atlantic Conference, which is one of the lower rated leagues in college baseball. They do have 69 homers. They do have a 306 collective average. Again, though, the stats don't really mean that much to me, given that they came against the 293rd strength of schedule in the country. If there's one guy to pinpoint in the lineup, Eric Radicek probably is the scariest. He's hitting 402 on the year. But from a pure number standpoint, there is a big time drop off after him in the lineup. Nobody else even hitting above 340. So if this matchup does come to pass, Niagara basically has 2 pitchers who stand head and shoulders above the rest in Zach Cameron and Max Ramirez. Of the 2, Cameron is the better one. They'll probably use him against Oklahoma State in the first game, and Florida would probably see Ramirez in the second game. That bullpen isn't really great behind those 2 guys. So if Florida can get to it early, yeah, of course, the disclaimer that it's baseball, anything can happen, but get to the Niagara bullpen and things look very bleak for them. And that brings us to Oklahoma State, the host, clearly the toughest competition for the Gators in terms of getting out of the regional. Oklahoma State is The only team in this regional I would say is actually definitively a better team than Florida. Nebraska's numbers in the Big Ten don't really cut much ice with me. Of course, Florida could very easily lose that game because Florida lost games to Stetson earlier in the year. But just looking at things objectively, I don't think Nebraska is a better baseball team than the Florida Gators are. Oklahoma State is. And they're a little bit like Florida in the sense that they're home run happy. 284 average as a team, not fantastic. 111 homers as a team. That is worrisome. That starts with Nolan Schubert, pretty clearly their most frightening hitter. Actually missed a few weeks of the season. He only played in 45 of their 57 games. Still leads the team with 20 homers, and he's hitting 355. Carson Bang and Zach Earhart also have some power, 17 and 12 homers to them respectively. Both of those guys also hitting above 320 for the year. Colin Brugman also has 14 homers. So definitely not as powerful a lineup as Florida, but it's kind of close to as powerful as Florida, and they don't rely on the long ball as much to win games. The 284 average isn't awesome, but they do get the clutch hits, and they can spray the ball around, having watched them I think in eight games I've watched them this year. They do spray the ball a lot. I wouldn't say that they love small ball and manufacturing runs that way, but they can do it. So again, definitely an offense that Florida's pitching staff is going to have its hands full with. Pitching wise for them is where it gets interesting because they only really have two tried and true starting pitchers in Brian Holiday and Sam Garcia. And much like Florida did a year ago, they have a decision to make here. Do they use one of their two best pitchers in the first game, or do they save them for games 2 and 3? If you remember last year in the regional, Florida went with Caglione. At that point, the weakest of Florida's 3 starting pitchers in game 1 against Florida A&M, and went with the other 2 guys, Brandon Sproat and Hurston Waldrop, in games 2 and 3. Does Oklahoma State do the same thing? Because they have questions there. Who is the third pitcher? Do they have any depth to have a 4th starting pitcher, or do they just do a bullpen game if it's forced? If they're forced to play a 4th game, maybe they use Carson Bang, who is a pretty good 2-way player who's come on recently for them in a starting role over the last month or so. But definitely some questions there. So Oklahoma State as a whole, definitely a very good team. Certainly one that you can say is worthy of hosting. Not a juggernaut by any means. Definitely a preferable 1 seed, a preferable team to play in a regional for Florida compared to what they could have drawn, like a Clemson, who actually they would draw in a super regional if Clemson can hold serve in their regional as the 6-11. Preferable to facing a North Carolina, preferable to facing an FSU for sure because of that strange right field fence they have that takes a lot of homers away. So you have to be, relatively speaking, happy with what the Gators have. So if there's a regional out there that seems to be the most favorable for this Florida team, it's probably this one. Because, yeah, Oklahoma State is the favorite for a reason, but they're far from dominant. Nebraska is an sort of 2 seed. They're not a bad team again, but again, I would certainly prefer them to Dallas Baptist or Wake or Duke or Indiana State. And Niagara, as a 4 seed, kind of is what it is there. So what do I think happens? Well, I'll put it this way. Last year, Florida came out of the losers bracket in its own regional to beat Texas Tech because they had a deeper pitching situation. This year, we don't have that. So if Florida doesn't start 2-0, if they go to the losers bracket in this regional, the season ends in Stillwater. I am 99.9% confident in saying that the season ends in this regional for Florida if they don't start 2-0, because they just haven't shown anything that tells me that they're capable of winning 3 straight games. They won 2 straight against Georgia. That was considered a Herculean feat for them. 2 isn't 3. If you start 1-1, you have to win 3 games in a row to advance. If you lose your opener, you have to win 4 straight games. So before I make picks, I will say I think Florida has about as favorable of a regional as you could ask for. And I actually think that Florida will win its opener against Nebraska, but I think that that's kind of where it ends. I think that Florida will then lose to Oklahoma State in the 1-0 game. I think that they will then engage in a shootout with Nebraska in a rematch in the 1-1 game. Nebraska, I think, will come on top. They will go to the regional final against Oklahoma State. Florida will get bounced out of the regional at 1-2. I hope I'm wrong, but just having watched this team invent ways to lose all year long, whether it was Shellnut misplaying the ball and left, whether it's running ourselves into double plays, whether it's just not getting clutch hits, whether our pitchers just don't hit their spots, it just, like I've said all last football season, good teams find ways to win games, bad teams find ways to lose games. And that even goes for when the level of competition actually goes down, which is crazy to think that Florida stepping out of the regular season and going into the postseason will actually face lesser competition than they were facing, like when they faced Texas A&M and Mississippi State and Georgia and FSU. None of those teams are here in this regional. So again, that works out nicely for Florida that they had such a tough schedule, because now the level of competition actually goes down. But again, I've seen them create so many ways to lose that I think that that's how their season ends, and it does end this weekend. If I am wrong, I think it's going to be because Liam Peterson and Pierce Capola both step up and have their best outings of the year. I would love to see Colby Shelton and Dale Thomas and Cade Curlin step up and help out Caglione by delivering clutch hits. And I will be as happy as anybody if the Gators can advance. But again, just having watched as much of this team as I have, I just think that there is a good reason to be skeptical. That's our show. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe on YouTube. Please give us a 5-star rating and a nice review on Apple Podcasts. We've got some great content coming soon covering all sports. We've got a quick softball preview of the Women's College World Series coming up. We've got an interview with a current Gator football player who figures to see a much bigger role in 2024. Excited for that. So definitely subscribe to be the first to watch that. And until next time, go Gators. We are in the NCAA Baseball Tournament, and if there's one thing we can hold above our rivals right now, it's that, you know what, FSU, yeah, you turn the tables. Link Jarrett is a better coach than he seemed to be in his first year. But you know what? In Florida's Chernobyl season, at least he made the tournament. FSU cannot say that. That's it, because that's really the only good thing we can say about Gator baseball, for as bad as it is. And it has not been a fun season for Gator baseball, but at least we made the NCAA baseball tournament. If nothing else, we can at least say that.